Good morning. It is Wednesday, October 31st. Happy Halloween, and this is The Drill. And thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. The two biggest mistakes that Sean Hannity makes, and actually the same two biggest mistakes that Rush Limbaugh makes. Number one is that he honors arbitrary claims, and number two, he spends way too much time talking about the left. So as far as the arbitrary claims are concerned, he does the same thing Rush Limbaugh does. He feels this compulsion to comment on everything that somebody on the left says. Every claim that the left makes, he feels he has to comment on and or defend himself or conservatism against an arbitrary claim. Wrong, 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 wrong. It's wrong because, first of all, you're honoring them. Okay, you validate the claim by arguing about it. Secondly, because it makes you look guilty, makes you look like you have a guilty conscience. And thirdly, because it puts all other conservatives, those of us that are actual conservatives, as well as faux conservatives like Sean Hannity, in the untenable position of having to continue to do the same thing. We're now under pressure. I'm now under pressure because the left is now going to feel free, since they see that it works, to make more arbitrary claims. And they're going to make arbitrary claims not just about Donald Trump and Sean Hannity, but about regular people as well. So now I feel like I'm under a tremendous amount of pressure to do as Sean Hannity does and argue with or against arbitrary claims. And so for those reasons, Sean Hannity needs to knock it off. If he wants to, he can note that it's an arbitrary claim, that calling Kavanaugh a misogynist. What evidence do you have of that? None. Okay, so then you say it's an arbitrary claim, and until there's evidence or proof put forward, I'm going to ignore it and leave it at that. Promoting the left. He spends more time promoting the left than he does promoting the right, Sean Hannity does. He spends all of his time talking about what the left is doing, what they're thinking. When his show starts, you have intro music, and then right after the intro music and just before Sean Hannity comes on the mic, there's the series of clips that he puts in of people on the left making usually really snotty remarks about conservatives and Donald Trump specifically. You'll get the clip about Holder saying, if they go low, we kick them, all that stuff. Negative, nasty. And then when he comes on the mic, then he wants to go on and talk some more about what it is the left said, what they did, all the insults that they're throwing around against conservatives. And I can't listen to the show for 3 hours a day. I just can't do it. You know, I can spend maybe, if I'm lucky, 20 minutes, and then I've got to change the channel. Because if I had spent 3 hours a day listening to this, I'd want to stick my head in the oven and turn on the gas. Okay, it's depressing and it's unnecessary. If there was nothing else to talk about, if conservatives weren't making positive contributions to this country, then I could understand. But that's not the case. They are. And Donald Trump, although not a conservative particularly, more of a populist, he still keeps his promises. He's kept his promises. He is delivering things. The economy is going great gangbusters. There's all kinds of things to talk about that relate to and promote conservatism. And Sean Hannity needs to get on the ball and start spending less time trying to downplay, denigrate socialism, and more time trying to promote conservatism. And back in a minute. thank you very much. Welcome back. And Tammy Bruce, I'm reading from her book called The Death of Right and Wrong. And there really isn't going to be a death of right and wrong, although it may seem that way. Again, it's going to be just simply the left is trying to change what is right and what is wrong. So in her book, we've been talking about cultural things. The new dirty word is apparently Jesus. That's what we had the last section of this particular chapter. This section is called News versus Sanctimonious Fatheads. Well, it would be offensive if Christians weren't so, quote, poor, uneducated, and easily led, unquote. That characterization, by the way, has a story of its own. It was widely reported in the fall of 1993 that is the way a Washington Post editorial described Christians, or at least evangelical Christians. In fact, the words are those of a Christian being interviewed by the Post. He was complaining that was the message he thought came through in Democrat Party commercials. It's nice to uncover an urban myth, but it's also unfortunate that it is so easily believed that a comment like that could be a major newspaper's editorial position. By the way, I wanted to make note here. She said in this particular sentence, he was complaining that this was the message that he thought came through in Democratic Party commercials. And I referred to it as Democrat because that's the word that should be used. Democratic is an adjective, not a noun. But the Democrat Party thinks they can do whatever they want. No, they can't. Okay? If they want to come up with a name, they have to use a noun. That's just the way it is. That's reality. Goes for everybody. Back to the book. However, let's see, the irregularity of Christian bashing in the nation's news media, however, made it all too plausible. Mary McGrory, for example, a longtime Post columnist and a Pulitzer Prize winner, had this to say about a very personal way in which some people were responding to the Columbine school massacre. Quote, "But when it comes to preventing violence in our schoolyards, some fathead is bound to say that prayer is the solution," unquote. Although not guilty of referring to Christians as easily led, the Washington Post instead can boast the less subtle insult that Christians and other people of faith are, quote, fatheads, unquote. How does a working journalist cover a pro-Christian rally these days? Here are some of the comments of Jake Tapper, Salon.com's Washington correspondent, in his coverage of the presidential rally for family, faith, and freedom. Quote, "And when they were all done, a bunch of us reporters went into town, got drunk, and ended up at a local strip joint called Big Earl's Gold Mine. There's only so much sanctimony a guy can take," unquote. There was a great deal at that rally that I also disagreed with. But really, enough is enough. This petty and childish style of attack is based on the kind of bigotry that the left supposedly finds so appalling. Furthermore, is the liberal thing to do really to get drunk and leer at women who no doubt would prefer not to be taking their clothes off for a brute like Jake Tapper? Oh, but I forgot. This is Bill Clinton's legacy. Next section, drip, drip, drip. Taken on their own, comments such as Sindra Wilson's and Bill Keller's and Mary McGrory's and Jake Tapper's could be dismissed simply as sloppy and juvenile journalism. Like a drop of water, each one alone is inconsequential, but taken collectively, story after story, comment after comment, big and small, drip, 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 they can wear away their target, as water can drill through stone. Ultimately, the solution to the Christian problem is simply to declare that God does not exist. Max Frankel, who was the New York Times executive editor from 1986 to 1994 and who currently writes a column for the paper, declared in Tikkun magazine in 2000, quote, "I have grown certain that humanity invented God," unquote. While believing there is no God is Mr. Frankel's absolute personal right, the fact that someone who for 8 years had that much power at the Times may explain something about the paper's coverage of religious matters. Many prefer to consider such disparagements of Christianity as eccentric outbursts that have no real impact on society. It is difficult, after all, to think of Christians as being under attack when part of the left's elite's drumbeat is that Christianity is the oppressor. How else do we explain the fact that when Christians protested the play Corpus Christi, which features a gay Jesus having sex with his apostles, a New York Times editorial condemned the protesters' bigotry, violence, and contempt for artistic expression, unquote, while saying nothing about the anti-Christian bigotry in the play itself. Drip, drip, drip. Quote, in painting and sculpture, the bashing of Christian symbols is so mainstream that it is barely noticed, unquote. Comments John Leo, one of the nation's most prolific and insightful social critics. Leo's examples in his U.S. News and World Report column include, quote, the Virgin Mary coming out of a vagina, Mary encased in a condom, Mary in pink panties with breasts partially exposed, an Annunciation scene with the Archangel Gabriel giving Mary a coat hanger for an abortion, Mary pierced with a phallic pipe, unquote. Drip, drip, drip. Next section, the last approved prejudice. Martha Bales, a professor of humanities at Claremont McKenna College, has termed this new depravity masquerading as art, quote, perverse modernism, unquote. Writing in the Wilson Quarterly on the flood of obscenity in popular culture, she made this observation, quote, to the familiar vices of popular culture, notably vulgarity and kitsch, perverse modernism has added a new twist, a radically adversarial stance towards society, morality, and art itself. That stance has gone from being the property of a tiny avant-garde a century ago to being part of the cultural mainstream today, unquote. How better for the cultural elite to promote their worldview than to use culture itself as a message to Americans that Christianity is not only passé, but worthy of denigration. While isolated attacks on an idea through imagery could be considered harmless, what we've been witnessing is a concerted, continual, multifaceted cultural attack on the ideas of decency and values, an attack perpetrated by the few who control the main images in our popular culture. What we're seeing today is very much the legacy of Andre Serrano. How could we forget Serrano's Piss Christ, a photograph of a crucifix submerged in a plexiglass container of the artist's urine? First presented in 1989, this travesty had a silver lining. It prompted Congress to take a closer look at what the National Endowment for the Arts was funding with our tax dollars. Many Americans felt that this was the big story, the revelation that Serrano had received $15,000 from the NEA and the subsequent hotly debated crackdown on the government agency. After that dust-up, however, Serrano did not fade away into obscurity. His work is now considered part of the canon in the art world. It has been shown around the globe and has a place in permanent collections as prestigious as those of New York City's Metropolitan Museum of Art and London's Tate Gallery. Piss Christ was actually featured in the second half of the American Century show at the Whitney Museum in Manhattan in 1999. If you still doubt how legitimate Mr. Serrano is now considered to be and how desensitized the rest of us have become, in 2001 his work was exhibited in the largest Gothic cathedral in the world, and no one was heard to complain. The Episcopal Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in Manhattan displayed 2 series by Serrano through the Lenten season. The program included a series of photos of corpses titled The Morgue. This part of the exhibition was housed in one of the cathedral's chapels. The Reverend J. Wegman, canon for liturgy and the arts at St. John the Divine, had this to say about the exhibition. Quote, I think you couldn't have a healthy spirit without having art to inform. Art is a window to the divine, unquote. Canon Wegman says he focuses on contemporary artists, quote, especially ones that can be seen through a theological lens, unquote. And Serrano's works qualify. What else has sprung from the twisted mind or window to the divine of the now renowned Andre Serrano? His Red Pope 1-3 is a series of photographs of an image of Pope John Paul II immersed in a container of blood. It sold in a 1999 Christie's auction for $70,700. Serrano certainly doesn't need our tax dollars anymore. And what has become of Mr. Ophelia, the man whose window to the divine produced the vile image of the Virgin Mary covered with feces and surrounded with pornography? One of his elephant dung paintings was expected to sell for over $100,000 at a recent Christie's auction. As my theory would predict, Serrano describes himself as a Catholic. Quote, lapsed Catholic, unquote, would be more accurate, considering that, quote, he hasn't received communion since he was 13 and goes to churches mostly for aesthetic purposes. He says he goes to churches like they were museums, unquote. Even with the brief overview I've given of trauma, malignant narcissism, and projection, it is clear that Serrano is projecting his demons onto the popular culture at our expense. As moral relativism and narcissism demand, Serrano doesn't contemplate the meaning or the consequence of his actions. Well, quote, "When I'm working on something, I don't ask myself why I'm doing it, nor the consequences it will bring about. And all this has nothing to do with morals. I've been accused of being sacrilegious and profane at my work. The morals, the judgment appears once the work is done. What I make has nothing to do with this," unquote. A funny thing to say about the consequences, funny thing to say for someone who claims he doesn't think about consequences, but somehow he knows it has nothing to do with morality. Whatever his flaws, Serrano does one thing beautifully. He exposes the dead heart of the left elite, one that refuses to look at itself, to face its demons, and to take personal responsibility. Because he is unable or unwilling to integrate back into the society of normal people, he is determined to make society look like him. New section, offended only at first. Of course, if your agenda is to lead society through the looking glass to a place where everything is the opposite of truth, one must go to the university. And that's exactly what Serrano has done. At Penn State, for example, he spoke to a group of students to the accompaniment of a slideshow of his work, ranging from, quote, shots of blood and milk to cum shots from the artist's very own penis, ejaculations, used maxi pads, a female prostitute performing fellatio, and a young girl sitting with her legs spread wide to reveal her underpants, unquote. What impact does a presentation of this sort have in an environment where young people are expected to absorb and accept what they are presented? Exactly what you'd think. They absorb and accept. Serving as a microcosm of what happens to all of us at the social level, students reported that they found the presentation offensive, quote, only at first, unquote, but then, quote, understood, unquote, it. Commented Amy Brennan, then a senior majoring in art education, quote, overall, I don't find his work offensive. He takes the vulgar and makes it beautiful, unquote. Jamie Gettle, a junior majoring in advertising, agreed with that the presentation was offensive at first, especially the close-ups of bloody menstrual pads. However, quote, after he talked about them, I understood what he was saying, unquote. For those whose goal it was to twist wrong into right, a good starting point is to convince young people that the vulgar is beautiful. For those whose goal it is, there it is, okay, good starting point. Once again, all you have to do is ask yourself, what do I want for my children, for the next generation? The young women at Penn State had the instinct to react at first with decency, and then they were taken through the looking glass. There's time for understanding, and there's a time for rejection. This is a time for the rejection of what Serrano and his ilk have in store for our future. New section, bringing it home. One of the most vicious ad hominem attacks on a representative of Christianity appeared in the January 4th through 11th, 2001 issue of Time Out New York, a local gay rag. John Cardinal O'Connor, the much-loved Archbishop of New York, passed away in May of 2000. In Time Out, New York's feature on the best and worst of 2000, this was cited as one of the best things. Cardinal O'Connor kicks the bucket. The press eulogized him as a saint when in fact the pious creep was stuck in the 1950s anti-gay menace. Good riddance. I've done my share of critiquing the Catholic Church on issues of politics and direction. I've had punchy things to say about Los Angeles' Cardinal Mahoney and even about Mother Teresa. I think political discussion and the questioning of authority an indispensable part of every system, including organized religion. But really, you don't need to be a Catholic to be appalled by this attack. It's truly embarrassing to be associated with a community that indulges in this kind of tripe. All the big showy Christian bashing does filter down eventually to your town, your friends, your family. It's meant to, like a cancer that spreads despite the fact that the body does not want it. How do local government and schools respond to the conditioning in popular culture that Christianity is bad? The Catholic League's report for 2001 includes these items. In the Seattle area, King County Executive Ron Sims issued a memo mandating the county employees use religion-neutral language when referring to the holidays. He cited as an example holiday greetings. Only after the league protested did Sims withdraw the edict. In Arizona, the Attorney General defended a decision made by one of her lawyers to ban the display of Santa Claus in her office. In New York City, the attorney for the school's chancellor issued a memo saying it was permissible to display Jewish and Islamic religious symbols, the menorah and the crescent and star, in the schools, but not a nativity scene. Minnesota daringly banned red poinsettias from a county courthouse in St. Paul, and kids were forbidden to wear red and green scarves in a middle school play in Rochester. The Catholic League cites the following as one of the more bizarre cases it's ever encountered. At the annual Halloween costume party at Sharon High School in Sharon, Massachusetts, 2 boys dressed as pregnant nuns and a third as the impregnating priest. The faculty awarded the trio first prize. In response to complaints from Catholic students in the mostly Jewish school, school officials confessed they were taken aback by the incident. They said they had been particularly on alert to make sure that none of the costumes would be offensive to Muslim students, this being a month and a half after the World Trade Center attack. As an additional corrective measure, the leading Jewish civil rights group, the Anti-Defamation League, was given permission to sensitize students to bigotry by discussing the Holocaust. All that is fine and good, but the case at hand involved an insult to Christians, not Muslims and not Jews. Christians, as we're seeing, do not count. Even when bigotry is exposed, we've all been so conditioned to respond to every other special interest or protected group that it doesn't even occur to us to sensitize students to anti-Christian bigotry. I'm convinced that these examples, which do not make the evening news, are the mutant children of the left elite's popular culture campaign to marginalize not religion per se, but Christianity specifically. Banning red and green colors, forbidding a nativity scene but allowing other religious expression, controlling religious speech, are all symptoms of the malignancy moving through the body. The underlying message is that Christianity is offensive and perhaps even dangerous. Quote, Christians are regularly targeted for ridicule and vilification by a significant portion of America's cultural elite, a situation all the more striking in view of the prevailing hypersensitivity toward other religious, ethnic, and lifestyle groups, unquote, write Vincent Carroll and David Shiflett in their book Christianity on Trial. They couldn't be more right. While the left elite push through hate crime legislation to benefit their favorite groups, when it comes to bashing Christianity, anything goes, especially if you call it art. Why this double standard? Simply because in the context of American history and society, it is Christianity, not Judaism, and not Islam, and not Buddhism or Hinduism or Zoroastrianism, that the last bastion of morality, values, and that is the last bastion of morality, values, and decency. And Lord knows we can't have that. No, values, decency, and morality must be snuffed out because the left elite have so much work to do. Their moral vacuum, like the Energizer Bunny, wants to keep going and going and going until our culture and society looks just like them, vague, empty, and lost. And the good thing about this particular section of the chapter, and that's the end of the chapter, by the way, chapter 2, is that, again, she talks and emphasizes the importance of culture and the importance of cultural influence, and that the battle that's going on, that the left is trying to influence our culture, because if they can succeed, is like what she says, then the rest of the politics of it is simple. Once you get the people to lay down culturally and accept cultural insults, then banning Christianity outright, or perhaps even banning Christian values, is right behind it, and will happen without protest. No one will protest. No one will say anything, and it will just simply happen. Now, all of this that the left is doing is not an end in itself, but is a means to an end, as always. And that end is socialist paradise. They've been convinced by Karl Marx that it is inevitable that the world will end up in a socialist world paradise, and that they will do whatever is necessary to either have us evolve into a socialist paradise, or create enough friction to produce a revolution that will result in socialist paradise. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the Black Book of the American Left. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome back. And The Black Book of the American Left by David Horowitz. Former lefty, now conservative. And so this is a chapter that's called What My Daughter Taught Me About Compassion. I'm going to skip most of it because I want to get right to the point here. He had written a piece. His daughter had passed away, and he has a conversation, or I guess a correspondence with her before she passed away, so it goes, for more than a decade, Sarah and I argued across the gap with much disappointment until I came to realize that I was missing a crucial element that connected her view and mine, because at this particular point in their relationship, he's conservative, she isn't. She's a lefty. That realization was crystallized in an exchange we had over a book I had written called The End of Time. In the book, I had observed that while the prophets of all the religions taught us to love each other as we love ourselves, and to think that, quote, there but for the grace of God go I, unquote, this advice was ultimately imprudent. Is it wise, I had asked, quote, to put our trust in strangers or to love our enemies as ourselves? Would we advise our children to do so, unquote? Then came a passage to which Sarah took great exception. Quote, I cannot embrace this radical faith. I feel no kinship with those who can cut short a human life without remorse, or with terrorists who target the innocent, or with adults who torment small children for the sexual thrill. I suspect no decent soul does either, unquote. Sarah took those words as an attack on the very rationale of her life and responded at first with anger, but she relented and then wrote me this, quote, my objection is that you're confusing compassion with gullibility. I do visit prisoners, and I think it matters to make that human connection. That doesn't mean I'd necessarily trust them with my purse. I wouldn't let the state execute them in my name either. I don't think kinship with other people who've crossed the line blurs my own morality. In fact, it gives me more clarity. If you see someone in the fullness of their humanity, you see how they are acting out their own confusion and suffering. This does not justify hurtful or evil acts. It doesn't even always inspire forgiveness. But if you see someone this way, you respond more in sadness than in anger. And that is simply a more excellent state of being, unquote. A more excellent state of being. My daughter had not only understood the limits we face in trying to repair the world, she had taught me that compassion like hers could be informed by a sense of those limits as well. Quote, even if you've never had this experience, unquote, she continued, quote, respect the experience of those who have. I'm not talking about an idea either. This is a full-bodied understanding of another person. This practice has, in fact, transformed all my relationships, including ours, by the way, unquote. So I think that was a very interesting way of putting it, making the distinction between compassion and gullibility. And on that note, I conclude another episode of The Drill, and I thank you for listening. Until next time, have a great day.